Welcome back, folks. Let me just remind you to please turn on your video unless you're doing something temporarily that you really don't want others to see. It is kind of weird to be talking to a bunch of blank boxes. We'll wait a little bit for everyone to pop back into our realm of existence, in particular our speaker.
And the class always fills up. So
Is Linda out there? Oh, there's Linda. Okay. All right, so let's go ahead and get started with the next session. And Linda, I wore my Occupy as Mars shirt just for you. I knew that you would like my neoliberal creds showing. Take it away.
All right, thank you. Well, first I want to say I'm really enjoying this meeting, and I'm so glad to see old friends and so many new faces, which is wonderful. That's what SSoCIA is trying to do, is build a community, bring in new people, bring in young people, bring in people from multiple disciplines. So this is just really terrific. I'm one of the oldsters in this community. I've been working in the space community since 1983. And I'm currently a part-time consultant to the astrobiology and planetary defense programs at NASA headquarters from 2002 till about 2010-12. I was a consultant to the Planetary Protection Office at NASA. And so I've been following planetary protection policy at somewhat of a distance since then, but I was fully engaged for a number of years. And my talk is really about the geopolitics of planetary protection. Thanks to Ted Peters, the paper I had proposed for SSoCIA 2020 was actually given a deadline for the volume that Ted Peters is co-editing on astrobiology ethics. So thank you, Ted, for getting me to finish this paper and get it published. I am concerned that particularly in the United States, there has been, and this really picked up during the Obama administration, strangely enough, things were kind of quiet on this front during the Clinton years. But in the Obama administration, the drumbeat really got louder to loosen up any kind of policy or regulation or requirement that might limit private sector activities in space. And so we hear a lot of talk about space mining. And of course, NASA has this wacky plan. They've hired some companies to pick up lunar resources and bring them back. It doesn't make any sense to me. The good news is, just as a longtime observer, I don't think space mining and space development are going to happen on the kinds of schedules that people are talking about. It's too hard, and consequently, it's too expensive. So, and the first two asteroid mining companies that came to the fore several years back are gone because they didn't really have a business case. And I suspect we'll see more of that happening. But my premise is that the 1967 Outer Space Treaty is, well, it is, I don't think anybody would argue about this, but it is the basis for international space law. And I think it's still a solid basis. It has something like 120 signatories, including, I believe, North Korea, which is interesting. And I'm kind of biased about protecting the Outer Space Treaty because my mentor and friend, Eileen Galloway, who passed away several years ago, was one of the American team tasked with helping to write that treaty. So we've had a lot of long talks about the treaty. And her premise, we talked about this probably a year before she died. She felt that the treaty should remain in place. It doesn't need to be messed with. We don't need another treaty. What we need is regulations. And as I said in my talk, the treaty establishes that states parties to the treaty are responsible for the actions of their players, whether they're governmental or private sector. But there has been just more and more talk, and not just outside NASA, but even inside NASA with the Mars exploration people, about the need to re-examine planetary protection requirements. And I think you probably all know that NASA's planetary protection policy, it's a mandatory compliance situation, whereas the COSPAR policy and the NASA policy since the 60s, I think, have been in parallel, and that the work on keeping those policies in parallel, and some other space agencies have planetary protection policies too, just a few, excuse me. But through the Committee on Space Research panel on planetary protection, and I've attended several of those meetings, those policies are kept up to date. And I certainly agree with the voices in the space science community who say that planetary protection policies need to be re-examined because we have learned so much more about potentially habitable environments in the solar system, and technology is advanced in terms of life detection technology. For a number of years, people at NASA were afraid to say the words life detection in public, but we are saying that now. And so I agree with that premise. What I don't agree with is that we need to loosen things up to let the private sector do what it wants to do, where it wants to do, when it wants to do it. We had some discussions yesterday about how some of us don't have much faith in expecting private sector entities to self-regulate, especially when it comes to environmental protection. And NASA has bent over backwards to respond to this mostly external critique, although Dave Beatty, who's I believe head of the Mars exploration program at the Jet Propulsion Laboratory right now, has basically said that we should discard the concept of special regions on Mars. And I actually participated in the first workshop where we started talking about whether and how to define special regions. In other words, regions of Mars that are considered to be more potentially habitable than other environments. And I actually am not sure what the status of the dialogue about special regions is right now. There have been proposals to establish planetary parks on potentially habitable planetary bodies. I don't think that's enough. The longer I've been watching this situation, the more I feel like we need to maintain stringent planetary protection requirements for Mars and other potentially habitable environments until we know for sure, and that's for sure is probably difficult to impossible to ever get to know for sure that those environments are not currently habitable. I'm with the camp in the astrobiology community who thinks that it's possible that there might be extant microbial life in the deep subsurface of Mars. We don't have any missions in the planning process that are actually going to get to the deep subsurface. And so we've had a drill on the latest mission to Mars that has had difficulty doing its job, and it was only going to go down maybe a meter beneath the surface. So that's still not deep subsurface. So we have so much more to learn about Mars, and I really miss the opportunity when we're all together in person to argue with Kelly about the folly of colonizing other planets. We had a lot of fun at the last two SSoCIA meetings. And that's probably all I need to say now. And I really would like to hear what you all have to say.
Okay, Neil.
Hi, always find your stuff interesting. This is just a political question, or your sense about American politics, which is certainly under the Trump administration, the Republicans have come to really identify big tech as a problem and as something that they're opposed to. And yet private space exploration seems to me to be now identified with those very same entities like Elon Musk. Do you see it flipping at all, maybe, so that the Democrats are the space exploration and an exploitation party, and the Republicans aren't. I don't really, but I just don't know how it plays out because it's
Oh, no,
such a weird
definitely not.
change.
No, the Republicans have been both in the White House and in Congress, and this actually predates when Jim Bridenstine was in Congress before he became administrator of NASA, before Trump was elected president. Jim Bridenstine was one of the people in Congress who were beating the drums for establishing legislative incentives to encourage private sector development of space. I actually not happy about this, but I don't see things changing much in the Biden administration. It's impossible to tell. We don't know who's going to be in charge, but I do not see the private sector backing off from pushing its deregulatory agenda. This is nothing new. I first entered the space community when Reagan was president, and he really pushed the deregulatory agenda. Things didn't get worse with George H.W. Bush. Things quieted down a little, but not enough during the Clinton administration. For instance, with the Federal Communications Commission, the Clinton administration didn't push hard enough, in my opinion, on a reasonable regulatory agenda. And then, of course, George W. Bush did his vision for space exploration back to the moon and onto Mars. One thing that bothers me a lot about media coverage of private sector activity in space is, well, first of all, there's hero worship. You know, Elon Musk didn't build those rockets. He might have had the idea, but he's not doing all the work. So the headline always says Elon Musk's SpaceX. And even though I loathe that guy, I have a lot of respect for the president of SpaceX, Gwynne Shotwell, who I think has done a good job, and I can't imagine how she's been able to work with him for all these years. But those companies, both Blue Origin, Jeff Bezos's company, and SpaceX, have received tremendous amount of direct subsidy and then contracts. I mean, it took years for SpaceX to build itself up as a leading US government contractor, both for DoD and for NASA. And I believe it's still, I'm not sure about this because I haven't checked recently, but I believe that SpaceX is even on the list of top 100 US government contractors. So, you know, that just disappears. And there have been local subsidies. SpaceX has been very aggressive about pursuing local subsidies to determine where it's going to develop its launch facilities. So yeah, I don't think things will get much better, but there are enough people in the science community who, as I said, NASA got quite aggressive about responding to these concerns by first responding to the recommendations of the NASA Advisory Council and its new Regulatory and Policy Committee that NASA needed to establish some kind of independent review of planetary protection policy. That was conducted and completed in about 10 months, which was pretty amazing. And it was very thorough and I thought very reasonable. And one of its recommendations was that there needed to be some kind of permanent independent review board in place. And so what NASA did, of course, NASA has to pay for all this stuff. NASA asked the Space Studies Board of the National Academy of Sciences to create a committee on planetary protection. And as far as I know, that will be a standing committee. I'm not quite sure what their near-term goals are in terms of producing reports or anything like that. But so it's a balance, and from day to day and week to day, sometimes the neoliberals are getting ahead, and then sometimes the science people are getting ahead. And right. I think that's just going to continue for the foreseeable future.
This is just so interesting. Thank you.
Sure.
All right, Carl.
How on earth are you going to enforce something like this, Linda? I mean,
well, at NASA, the way that planetary protection requirements are enforced is that they're a team of mostly contractors who spend a lot of time at spacecraft construction facilities, you know, at JPL and at NASA Goddard. And they put on their bunny suits and they swab and they test and they take a lot of photographs. I used to share an office with Paris Tabekis, who's now retired, and he did this kind of work for something like 30 years. And he had like this huge whiteboard in his office that had schedules for inspection for all of the missions that were under development. So it sounds like a simple idea, but as you say, how do you enforce it? So far at NASA, the Planetary Protection Officer and her minions seem to be satisfied with their ability to access spacecraft construction facilities to get into clean rooms. My US colleagues believe, although they're basically going on word, that China and Russia so far, and China and Russia are participating in the COSPAR panel on planetary protection. And we believe, although we have not been able to go to their facilities and do inspections, that they are complying with COSPAR policy. That compliance with COSPAR policy is not mandatory because COSPAR has no ability to enforce the policy. But at NASA, so far, it's worked very well. And Michael Meltzer, the late Michael Meltzer, space historian, did, I think it was, I just pulled it out yesterday and I forgot. I think it came out in 2010, 2015, When Biospheres Collide. And it's a history of NASA's planetary protection policy, which started out as quarantine policy. And then some lawyers said, well, you can't talk about quarantine when you don't know if there's anything alive to quarantine. So, so they changed it to planetary protection. That's just a semantic thing. But so far, NASA has been able to maintain compliance with planetary protection requirements. So I'll cross my fingers and hope that persists.
Okay,
Thank you.
Jim?
Yeah, Linda, great talk as usual. I've got a cat trying to knock things over at my desk, so I'm getting distracted here. So you're taking these essentially geopolitical objections to sort of, a shift of the status quo to more one that favors the sort of, neoliberal goals in space. And I'm just wondering, do you take that argument to be specifically directed at planetary protection as it's currently envisioned? Do your premises prove more than the conclusion you're drawing here, I guess? Because a lot of people know I sort of push for wider protections for science than mere astrobiology. So I don't know if you're amenable to that, or if you think that the critique you're bringing to the kind of false prophecy of the neoliberal space agenda really only gets us to firming up the existing protection policies.
Yeah, I agree. I am definitely amenable to thinking more broadly about protection beyond planetary protection policy. Kelly, I think yesterday talked about how, space exploration in the near future is going to be the Wild West. I've heard that before. It gives me nightmares. So I just don't know how far we can get in the current geopolitical environment with establishing a reasonable, acceptable regulatory regime. And of course, the UN has no ability to establish and enforce regulations. So this has to be done by member states. And again, I think the treaty establishes, and of course, treaties are legal documents, which means that lawyers continue to dissect them and reinterpret them and all that kind of stuff. Same thing with laws. But I think it's possible. And of course, the problem with the UN is that business at the UN moves at a snail's pace. So you can be talking about something for 15 years before even a resolution goes to the General Assembly. So, the UN is a useful place. The Committee on the Peaceful Uses of Outer Space is a useful place to engender and maintain these global dialogues about these issues. But in terms of actions, that's going to have to be at the national level.
Okay, Joe.
All right. Thanks, Linda. So I don't know if I would call myself a neoliberal, but I am on a the different end of the position, I think, from a lot of the people talking in this session right now. So I guess the question I want to ask is perhaps a bit simple-minded, but it is something I find genuinely puzzling. So in what I would prefer, right, is I don't want to say extreme development, but probably something closer to that end. But I guess just shifting back from that, right, so something less extreme. Why is it? It almost seems as if in this debate, there's this assumption that planetary protection and space exploration, or even minimal development, are almost mutually exclusive. And I don't want to put that idea on you per se, but at certain points, it almost seems like that's an assumption working in the background. And I take it that can't quite be right, or at least I don't see why it should be right. So I guess I'm wondering, Linda, from your perspective, what you think about what the precise limits there would be, if at all, right, on our opportunities to develop space, given a prerogative for planetary protection. What can we do, in your opinion? What would the limits of that be? What would it look like? That kind of thing.
Thank you, Joe. That's great. Jim Schwartz and I have had talks, and of course, Jim has written even more extensively than I have about, and many people in our community, actually, Kelly and Carlos pulled together that special issue of Futures based on our discussion at the last SSoCIA about whether to colonize or not. And I have to tell you, my preprint of my little essay there and the 2 pieces I published in Theology and Science have gotten a lot of reads in these online archives, lots of reads. I don't know what people are saying about them, but lots of reads.
I've read one of your articles on this, but yeah. So.
Oh, good. Yeah, I don't think that planetary protection and space development are mutually exclusive. I do think that we, let's say, spacefaring nations are culturally, morally, socially evolved enough to do it safely. So I just pull this number out of the air. Maybe 100 years from now, we'll be prepared. Maybe we'll have better global governance structures in place 100 years from now. I have no idea. And maybe we'll all be living underground because we burned everything on the surface of the earth. Who knows? We just don't know which way we're going at this point. But I don't think they're mutually exclusive. I'm not 100% opposed to the idea of extending human presence into space, but the way we're talking about it now is not good. Not to be too technical, but it's just not good. And the argument that we've trashed the planet and used up our resources, and so we need to establish colonies in space to perpetuate the human race, I do not accept that argument at all. It doesn't make any sense to me, and this is my own both my professional perspective and my personal perspective. That argument just does not hold water for me. And I think right now our top priority needs to be preserving our planet as a habitable environment for human beings while we figure out what we can afford to do next.
Okay, sadly, we're going to have to move on. It's not sad because we're moving on. It's sad because we have to terminate this conversation.